afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Propagandacast State of the Balance with me, your host, Imperial Dane, with my co-host, Basil the Kitten. And, of course, we're going to have a look at what's happened in the last month. Has there been any sort of major meta shake-ups? Not particularly. I mean, we're still waiting for any sort of balance patches to really, do that. So, until then, there's not really been any sort of major meta shifts as such. But let you know, go through the details anyways. I mean, overall, the Surge remain probably one of the strongest factions. They have sort of a lot of varied strategies. Conscript builds, penal tool builds, support weapon builds. Some players mix them up. Doctrine, they'll go, though, for a lot of Guards Motor with Guards Rav. Those are still the very much most common doctrines. Armored Assault is also very popular. Basically, T-45s and IS-2 tend to be sort of on the more common late games, with some in team games going for the ISU-152. But Guardsmen are very much a popular feature, due to being, well, pretty potent with the DP light machine guns. So that's sort of what's happening here with the Surge. Nothing's really changed. There's been an increase in people actually trying out H&6s in case they've come under pressure from the Wehrmacht. As you know, the Axis, well, the Optimus sort of trying to push them here and there. There has been a slight increase in those, but for the most part, though, they're just going to go for a T-70, maybe 2, and then otherwise push for medium armor. So in that regard, not much has changed there. I mean, overall, the question if you really need to change something with the Surge, you need to change something with the Axis, because again, the Surge are very much the dominant faction, they're very much popular. So I mean, is it really because the Surge are really, really good, or is it because the Axis just need something here and there? I mean, that's sort of the big question there. But I mean, if something was to be nerfed, I'd probably argue maybe the Guardsmen could do with a slight look at, or just the support weapons. I still feel like support teams, there being 6-man, I think makes the so weapon teams way too good. It makes it up to flank and get rid of them. In particular, stuff like the field guns, which can also double as artillery, becomes incredibly potent and a real pain. I feel like they need to reduce the number of crewmen there from like 6 to at least 5, but preferably 4. In particular, if they insist on having the others, that great degree of utility on the field gun. That one, I think, definitely is currently overperforming and it needs a serious look at. Moving on to the Americans are, as always, the half-asleep faction. That is, you can basically sleep your way through it if you know what you're doing to a degree, because the Americans just have so much firepower and are built as a snowball faction. And I do feel like that probably needs a looking at as well. I do feel to an extent it actually probably encourages the American players not really to improve upon their gameplay, because they can just get away with skating through the game basically on the back of the riflemen. So I definitely feel like riflemen need some sort of look at, or the failing that, they really need to look at the teching, handing out free units at a pretty much low cost of teching as well. I mean, there's just basically one big gravy train with the Americans at the moment, and that's just not particularly good. In particular with the Wehrmacht, it tends to make it sort of feel like an incredibly uphill battle, where if you make one mistake, they just completely roll over you. Like, there's, I think, a definite need there for someone to, either look again at the Wehrmacht, but at the Americans some way or the other. In particular, also when they just take into Lieutenant, which is a great, better rifleman, and then straight into the anti-aircraft Taft, which is also really potent. It's just piling on and piling on and piling on with the Americans, and I do not feel like that is particularly good balancing, to be honest. Like, it just sort of results in the situation again, but then finally beat them. The other chap's like, what am I supposed to do now, except just considering other options? But even then, the Americans have the ability to just bounce back so easily, simply due to the sheer firepower they possess. I mean, you get people who just use the Jacksons like tanks because it can take that many hits. So, like, another option, looking into just nerfing the American late game a bit, since they are supposedly an early game faction, but the way it's built, it doesn't really feel like that. It's great early game, mid game, late game. So one option would be nerfing the late game a bit, maybe just making the American Sherman's armor-piercing rounds, for example, less great as an infantry. That way, forcing them to switch between armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds a bit more than currently, where basically the armor-piercing round for the Sherman is the standard round for the Panzer IV. Like, there is no trade-off involved, and that's probably one way of looking at the Americans. They just really don't suffer any trade-offs most of the time. So I feel like with the case of the Americans, it's just a case of the faction being heavily overtuned and just no one, stopping to ask why. And if someone did, they just got shouted down, because heavens forbid someone, does that, apparently. So yeah, there's probably need of some work there, to be honest. Or again, Wehrmacht late game gets another big push, a proper push. Moving on to the Brits, they're definitely one of the factions sort of in a weirder spot. I mean, in some ways the sections are really powerful. They get to snowball away with a lot of just large infantry sections. They can just crush their opponents. And there's also an increase in players just going for sim cities again, just get a bunch of mortar emplacements and a buffers, lock it all down. And it becomes incredibly difficult to deal with because they can soak up so much damage. It's just deal with so much damage as well there. So, like, I mean, the problem is basically the British design is it's just all hinges on those emplacements. And of course, then everything's supposed to carry up for just this awkward stuff. The problem is it could just realize it results in the situation if they don't rely heavily on those, you're fighting in a massive disadvantage to a degree, unless of course you just blow up a lot. So technically, you can't really fight very tactically with the Brits. You just have to cheese it out due to how they're designed, which is not really good design, is it? And of course, it seems like they're really, really reluctant to actually changing those bits, like, you know, giving them some more flexible weapon systems. So the question, of course, is, what do you do? I mean, I think that's sort of the big question at the moment. What do you do with the Brits? I mean, I'd probably suggest nerfing the emplacements a bit and then somehow not compensating necessarily, but just making them cheaper, you know, cheaper emplacements, but at the same time emplacements like, you know, can't soak up an ungodly amount of damage. Because the problem is, again, in particular on smaller maps, they can just cluster it all up and just lock down a large chunk of the map, and it just turns into an absolute boring meat grinder, and that's not particularly exciting. So I mean, there needs to be some sort of thing looking at, and they just make the emplacements cheaper so you can actually afford to lose them, but on the other hand, make it so they can actually be lost without necessarily the opponent having to sink, you know, an ungodly amount of resources, and for that matter, just wanting to consider quitting the game, because really, there's just nothing as boring as just having to deal with, you know, bloody Sim City. It's just, I still have to wonder why they would repeat that path after it turned out to be pretty unpopular, at least in my own experience, in Company as 1. It's a bit weird why they went there, and of course doubled up with advanced emplacements. There's certainly some oddities there, to put it very mildly. So that will certainly cover my thoughts there. We'll have to see where it ends up with, to be honest. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure what to do with the Brit, but again, my immediate suggestion would be make the emplacements cheaper, but also less durable. Maybe switch some numbers around here and there in terms of, you know, like tech and resources. Maybe, you know, buff some things here to compensate, but again, it's the problem is a bit the British design. I mean, they sort of, the thing with Relegis, when they try to create new factions rather than just, you know, look at interaction between them, just decide, right, we give them this really big limitation, and then to compensate, we give them really strong infantry. It happened with the Oberkommando, it happened with the Americans, and then went to the extreme with the Brits. Like, when it comes to designing new factions, I think the issue with Relegis, they need to stop just giving, you know, big limitations and then buffing the infantry to compensate, because that's basically what they do every single time. Like, they need to start looking at how the different units work with each other, and I think sort of try to, you know, make the factions work within those contexts, because I really fear for Company C if they're just going to just keep up with that, you know, line of thought if they ever get around to it. So that's sort of, you know, be my thought. And again, at this stage, fixing the British, of course, is more or less not going to happen, but I'd still wish they just sort of overhauled some elements of the faction somehow. And then finally we move on to the Axis, the Oberkommando West, full scanners with assault rifles. I think, overperforming bit, they're just pretty much the primary thing. They can be beaten, but in a lot of cases they just sort of roll over. I think the issue is basically the assault rifles actually have a bit of trade-off in sort of how they perform at different ranges, because currently they do not. It's just a straight-up upgrade. Or the full scanners need to make slightly less durable for some of the received accuracy bonuses again. I mean, once more get to the debate there again, they design a faction with some awkward limitations, and then they compensate by just making the infantry really, really durable and really, really good, which just leads to problems repeatedly. British infantry sections are a problem, riflemen are definitely a problem, but they seem really, really afraid of touching them, and of course the full grenadiers are a problem. Like, I just wish they'd stop doing that. Like, it's really, I think, the primary issue with the Oberkommando, the Americans, and the Brits. Like, again, it just boils down to the whole, we add some limitations on them, which means they don't get stuff everybody else got, and then to compensate, we make the infantry really, really tough, because that totally does not lead to blobbing and just other terribly dull things. So with the Oberkommando, the Volkskriegs need a looking at there, I believe. Sturmpanzers could maybe receive something slightly beneficial to compensate in terms of later game, though not right away, otherwise it's just going to be Sturmpanzer spam. And by the way, going for a couple of Sturmpanzers right now can actually be surprisingly good. So I probably suggest nerfing that a bit, but otherwise I'm not really so sure what else to do about the Oberkommando West as such. Like, they're always thinking in a reasonably good condition. Of course, the mid-game sort of still is a bit rubbish, but the question is where do you sort of go with that without necessarily, pushing something else a bit too much. That's a bit the trickier bit, to be honest, and the answer is I'm not entirely sure. Maybe add some sort of mid-game upgrade that sort of helps in some other way. Maybe something for the Sturm Pioneers, or maybe something for the Obersoldaten. Like maybe a 5th man for the Sturm Pioneers. That could be an idea actually. It's like a 5th man upgrade for the Sturm Pioneers. Once they got 2 trucks up, you can unlock that. Might make them a bit too good, but at the same time it might make Sturm Pioneers more viable in the mid to late game, which is sort of a bit of an issue. They're not quite. So maybe that could be an idea. Maybe that could be a plus. It could also then, make the whole battle group mechanized to something besides, going for Command Panthers. And I'm also starting to think they need to make the Command Panther require Shroud Panzer quarters or something else. Or maybe they could just slightly lower its reload speed compared to other Panthers, so it doesn't become just de facto straight up better Panther, which again doesn't really incentivize teching too much. And then you finally move on to the Wehrmacht. The Wehrmacht does have some options, but most of the time it's still go for Grenadiers, MD-42s, Tier 2, Pack 40, maybe a 2-2, maybe Panzer Grenadiers. Panzer Grenadiers are slowly catching on with some players, but still for the most part not, and then move to Tier 3. Some will go for Tier 4, but it's slightly dropping off again. I mean, the overall issue, I think, is basically Wehrmacht Tier 4 still lacks something for the infantry. I mean, Wehrmacht's issue is still the infantry. Compared to the tendency of getting wiped, and once it gets wiped, it's really difficult for the Wehrmacht to easily get back, and again, they're the late game faction. So I still feel like they need something in the Tier 4 there to help with the infantry. Either upgrades for the Panzer Grenadiers and Grenadiers, or some sort of, elite unit on top of that they can produce. They're a bit like the Knights Cross Shoulders, where for the original Wehrmacht, and again, like they brought over the Wehrmacht from Companies 1, but removed a lot of things that made it work, and they didn't really compensate for that. And that's sort of, I think, what repeatedly crops up as the Wehrmacht in Companies 2's issue. It's just lacking a lot of those things that was supposed to make it work. So that could probably be one idea, just slightly give something there. Maybe another option would be also to look at some of the abilities the Wehrmacht has, like target weak point. It's an utterly superfluous ability at this stage. I'd probably recommend replacing with something like, say, heat rounds, what elite armor gets, bit of extra damage, penetration. Can that way used to sort of punish head-on armored assaults, just if the opponent gets a bit reckless, or support attacks. I mean, again, it would require a bit of time and all that, but again, that would mean an increased skill gap and wouldn't necessarily stun up units. So I think that could be a better idea there for the Stugs, or I don't know, some sort of bombardment ability, or suppressive fire for its machine guns. Those could be ideas. And I think for the Blitzkrieg ability for the Wehrmacht Panzers, all that, I think they need to give it a bonus so that actually it fires faster on the move, so that actually is encouraged to actually Blitzkrieg, because right now it's only really good to get out of there. There's no real incentive to get aggressive with it, and again, it would create sort of more scenarios where you have to set things up, but again, you can then do more damage. I mean, it'd sort of be more like tactical advance for the Stormtroopers, which is an ability I think is great, and I think we need more of. I think sort of more of those style abilities for the Wehrmacht could certainly also prove to be helpful for making the Wehrmacht's late game a bit less rubbish. So I mean, that would probably be an idea there as well to sort of consider. I mean, it's not like the Wehrmacht is as bad off as usually say early in the year, but like I still feel like in terms of how the design is supposed to go, there are some issues. So I think that sort of covers the state of the balance here for August 2018. Things are better, but I still feel like there are some issues, and again, apart from just boiled down to the whole relic, let's add a limitation to this faction so they look a bit more funny compared to the other factions, but to compensate, we just buff the infantry. I'm sure that won't lead to any issues at all, and of course it did. So there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed this little state of the balance. Hopefully it gave you ideas, something to look out for. If it did, subscribe, like, share, comment on it. This is Imperial Lane signing off. We're back another time with another video. Cheers, everybody.